The Road of the Hanging Tree. He chose the wrong night to ride. No moon rose over the heath, no breeze to comb the reeds by the marsh. The world lay pressed flat by a lid of cloud, and the only light came from a cold ribbon of stars, briefly visible, then veiled again as the sky breathed. The road, if you could call it that, was a pale thread through black pasture, with hedgerows on either side crouching like the backs of sleeping beasts. Jonah Carver kept to the center of that thread, one hand on the reins, the other on the horn of the saddle. The leather creaked with the rhythm of his horse, a sturdy bay named Bracken who had carried him through summer storms and spring floods and never balked at a task. They had set out late from the miller's, pockets heavier than usual with coin for a job done well, and the promise of a fire and bread at home felt close enough to taste. "Easy," Jonah murmured, though Bracken needed no soothing. The bay's ears pricked forward, finding the way even where Jonah's eyes could not. Hoofbeats drummed a steady litany. Gravel hissed. Somewhere a nightjar clicked its dry tongue. The solitary path was older than the parishes it stitched together. Its stones remembered carts that no longer rolled, peddlers whose songs were now dust. Every village child grew up on the same warning. Do not take the road under a new moon. Do not take it alone. But coin makes a man brisk, and Jonah had tested luck before and found it, more often than not, willing to be courted. They had nearly reached the rise beyond which the land sloped toward his cottage and the river when Bracken slowed. Not a stumble, not a paused descent, a slowing that was a thinking, a weighing of something Jonah could not measure. "Up," Jonah said softly, shifting his weight to encourage more pace. The horse responded with a step and then another, each one placed with such delicate care that Jonah felt it in his own ribs. The hedgerows closed in, their thorny fingers leaning, and the path narrowed to a pinch between them. Jonah recognized the place. Two hawthorns arched like a broken gate, and, beyond them, though he could not see it, an ash tree that threw long shade, even at noon. Bracken stopped. Jonah, unprepared, pitched forward and caught himself with a curse, the bridle leather biting his palm. The horse stood planted, iron shoes gripping soil as if he had rooted like a stump. "Go on," Jonah whispered. He clicked his tongue. He nudged with his heels, first gentle, then firm. Bracken's ears flicked back, catching the sounds of Jonah's suggestions, but the horse did not move. "Stubborn tonight, are you?" Jonah forced a chuckle. "Home's not more than a mile. There's oats waiting." The wind did a peculiar trick then. It ran along the hedges and silenced the insects. The nightjar's clicking ceased. Jonah felt it, a listening in the dark, not with ears but with the weight that comes when a door opens and a colder room waits on the other side. Bracken trembled once, not with fear, with refusal. "Come now," Jonah said, his own voice too loud. "Walk on." The horse's breath plumed invisible in the cold. Jonah smelled it, sweet and damp, mingled with the odors of leather and the dry weeds beside the road. He dismounted, boots touching earth with a thud that sounded like a trespass. The hedges pressed closer, and the gap ahead, the place between the hawthorns, felt less like a gap and more like a mouth. He took the reins near the bit and tugged. Bracken set his neck, not violent but immovable. Jonah braced and pulled with both hands. The horse did not shift so much as a hair. "All right," Jonah muttered, making himself patient. He produced a carrot from his coat. He always carried one. He was that sort of rider, and held it beneath Bracken's muzzle. "See? A treat. Then we go." Bracken's lips searched and took the carrot, crunching once, twice, grateful but not persuaded. The carrot's scent hung briefly, bright as summer, and was gone. Jonah tried every trick he knew. He clucked. He sang. He walked in a circle to coax motion back into the animal's legs. He loosened the girth a notch and then tightened it again, as if discomfort had been the cause. He examined the horse's feet, running his palm along fetlocks and pasterns for heat or pain. He found none. He backed Bracken 3 steps, then asked him to move forward. 3 steps came, and then, again, the refusal fixed and absolute. The hedgerows whispered, though no wind moved. From beyond the hawthorns, the road continued, and beyond the road, Jonah knew the ash tree stood in the ditch's elbow, its branches like knotted fingers. He had tied his mare there as a boy while he threw stones into the rivulet. He had leaned his back against it one summer afternoon with a girl and made promises he did not keep. There was nothing in that tree to frighten a horse. Bracken, Jonah said, now angry because fear had set its teeth in him and anger was easier to hold. Move, blast you. The horse shifted his weight and lowered his head, not in stubbornness, not in threat, but with something like respect, as if acknowledging that he heard and could not comply. Jonah stood in the road, the world bent around him into a funnel, the hedges, the hawthorns, the unseen ash gathering him toward a single point. That was when he heard the voice. It had not come from ahead or behind, not from the hedges or the sky. It arrived the way cold arrives, everywhere at once. Put the saddle on backwards. Jonah's scalp prickled. He turned, searching for the speaker, finding only the soft rise of the hedges and the black slope of pasture beyond. His tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. Who's there? The night, polite as a host, said nothing. Bracken blew, ears tilting as if he too had heard. I've no time for tricks, Jonah called, though his chest had tightened enough to make breath a chore. Show yourself or be off with you. Put the saddle on backwards, said the voice. Not loud, not urgent, as if commenting on the weather. It had no age he could name, no accent he could place. It brushed the tiny hairs on his forearms into attention. Jonah looked to the saddle as if seeing it for the first time. Warm leather, familiar as his own hands. Backwards? He barked a laugh out of raw nerves. Nonsense. Bracken pawed once at the road. Jonah swore to himself he felt, in that small motion, not impatience but agreement. Backward, Jonah said to the horse, to the hedgerows, to the night. He waited for the voice to add more, to explain itself. It did not. Only that one instruction, the world's oddest key. Hell with it, Jonas said. He slipped the girth, slid the saddle down, lifted it, and turned it so the cantle faced Bracken's withers and the pommel pointed toward the tail. The tree bit him clumsily in the shoulder as he adjusted, as if the familiar shape had become a stranger in his arms. He laid it on carefully, breath shallow, keenly aware of his own ridiculousness. He tightened the girth. He stood back. He stared at the absurd picture he had made. Happy, he said to no one. The night watched. Best we see, Jonah muttered. He placed his boot in the stirrup that now hung where a stirrup had no business hanging and eased his weight up and over, arranging himself so that he faced Bracken's tail. He must look, he thought with a flash of helpless humor, like a fool drunk enough to misplace the front of a horse. Walk on, he said, voice thin. Bracken did. Not with reluctance, not with nerves. He stepped forward between the hawthorns, as if he had only been waiting for a puzzle to be solved. The hedge's roots were closer to Jonah's eyes now. Facing backward, he watched them slide away as the horse took them past the pinch and into the dark beyond. A sound rose on the far side of the hawthorns, not a sound exactly, but a pressure in the ear, a held breath multiplied. The hedges there grew taller, hemming the lane into a tunnel. Bracken's ears flicked back toward Jonah's knees, listening past him to whatever lay unseen ahead. Steady, Jonah said. He meant it for himself as much as for the horse. They entered a cold that had nothing to do with the night air, the kind of cold old churches keep, or caves, or graves. Jonah's skin tightened under his coat. He faced backward and saw only where they had been, the broken gate of hawthorns shrinking, the safer night falling away behind like a door gently closing. Do not turn, the voice said. Close his thought. I wasn't going to, Jonah lied. The horse's stride shortened, not lagging, but careful, as if he picked his way among unseen obstacles. Jonah resisted the animal impulse to twist his shoulders and look over his own to see what lay ahead. His hands tightened on the reins that came now toward him from the wrong direction, draped over Bracken's rump. He kept his gaze fixed on the diminishing gap behind them, their exit, their past. He heard creaking then, the kind of sound a barn makes when it settles, the kind of ship makes when it rides a swell, the kind of rope makes when it carries weight. He heard breath, several breaths, uneven, catching. He heard the tiny clack of wood against wood, irregular, a breeze playing old bones. The hedgerows fell away on the right, and the black bulk of the ash tree should have been there, its trunk leaning like a man who has suffered a blow. Jonah stared pointedly at the hawthorns they had left, at the stars above them, at the slice of sky where the cloud had torn and mended and torn again. He stared at everything except what was ahead. Bracken kept moving, his shoes placing quiet on dirt. The creaking grew louder, then softer as they passed. Jonah's throat closed. He swallowed and tasted iron. He could feel, in the air he pulled into his lungs, the stale sweetness of rot long finished, and something else. A penny tang like water left in a copper cup. "Don't look," he whispered to himself, and for once he obeyed himself. They went on like that for what could have been 10 steps or 100. Time unstrung itself. Jonah's mind filled with the work of not looking, which is larger work than looking has ever been. He counted Bracken's breaths. He counted his own heartbeats. He recited, for no reason he could name, the names of millstones he had lifted in spring, as if the world might be held together by the catalog of ordinary labors. Bracken stopped. The cold thinned like fog burned off by a hidden sun. The hedges softened, the lane widened, the night returned to the temperature it had been. It took Jonah a moment to realize his clenched jaw ached. He let out a breath he had been hoarding and found, to his embarrassment, that it came out as a laugh. "Good lad," he said, patting Bracken's rump because his shoulder was not in reach. The horse swished his tail once, a lazy contentment. Jonah looked at where they had been, just a dark line of hedge and the suggestion of the hawthorn's arch. He felt his neck muscles loosen the way and not relax as under heat. He slid down, boots in the dust, and set about riding the world. The saddle turned proper, the girth tightened, his mind put back in its accustomed shape. Bracken shook, a full body ripple that went from ear tips to tail tip, and dust lifted from his coat like the veil of a widow loosened at last. Jonah mounted facing the way men do and nudged the bay into a trot. The rest of the road spilled out unremarkable as a shrug. He crossed the little bridge over the river, and when he saw the dark thatch of his own roof paint itself against the sky, he laughed again, this time with relief so simple and vast it made him young. At his gate, he dismounted and stood for a moment with his forehead against Bracken's neck. The horse's warmth went into him like a draft of something strong. "Thank you," Jonah said. Inside, the hearth accepted fire, the kettle took its place, and the bread, too long waiting, forgave him. He slept as if he had not slept in months. In his sleep, a sound came once more, the small, irregular clack of wood against wood and the sigh of ropes. He did not dream faces. He did not dare. Morning brought the ordinary pleasure of light. Frost filmed the windows. Beyond them, the pasture had a sugar crust. Jonah fed Bracken and the chickens, and then himself, then set out for town with a mind to buy nails and salt, and, because it was on his way, a visit with Thomas Hale, who collected stories the way some men collect tools. Thomas's cottage squatted on the bend before the lane split to the church and the smithy. Smoke rose from his chimney in a column that bent and then straightened as the breeze decided itself. Thomas had been a soldier once, then a farrier, then a man whose presence at births and deaths alike was welcomed, not for skills which he had, but for the way he could set a room at ease by listening. "Carver," Thomas said, when Jonah ducked beneath the low lintel, "and the devil at your heels to make you out this early?" "Only errands," Jonah said, but Thomas's eyes had already narrowed. There was flour on his hands. A loaf cooled on the sill, and another rose in a bowl by the hearth. its skin puffed and proud. "Tea?" Thomas asked. "Please." They sat at the little table that had borne more tales than plates. Jonah told the one about the miller's wife who swore her cat had learned to open the pantry lest it starve on pride. He asked after Thomas's hip, which plagued him in damp weather. He commented on the church roof, which leaked. All of this done at the speed of humidity, slow and patient, because some stories, like creaks, will not be hurried without losing their clarity. When the silence between them had turned transparent and hospitable, Thomas tilted his head. "Now you can tell me the one you came to tell." Jonah had thought himself clever enough to bring it up casually. "On the road last night," he said, and his throat betrayed him by tightening on the second word. "Bracken wouldn't pass between the hawthorns. Wouldn't move. I did everything, carrot, coaxing. Then I heard someone. A voice. It said to put the saddle backwards. I did it like a fool, and he went. He went through as calm as you like. After away, we set it right and came home." Thomas held his mug between both hands as if, by warming them, he could warm the air around the tale. He did not laugh. He did not frown. He let the words take their shape between them, and then asked, "Which hawthorns?" "The broken gate before the ash," Jonas said, surprised and not surprised to find his voice turn quiet on the word ash. "By the ditch." "Ah," said Thomas. "Oh, what?" Jonah demanded, suddenly annoyed to find there was a word for this, a place in the catalog. "Say it plain." Thomas peered at him over the mug's rim and then set it down with care. "You passed by the tree of the hanging men." Jonah's skin went cold in patches, like sunlight finding gaps in a cloud. "There's no such." Thomas lifted a palm, asking only for a breath. "Not in the way a child's story makes things. In the way a place gets a name for doing a job too often. That ash has held more weight than birds." Jonas saw, in the back of his mind, the way the hedges had leaned, the way the road had tightened, the way the air had grown cold. "Men." Years ago, Thomas said, eyes on some fixed point in the past, when the road was rougher and the law thin. There was a winter with not enough wood for the gallows and too many necks named for it. They used what stood. A band of men took justice in their own hands. Or vengeance. Or sport. Depends who tells the tale. Some they hung for crimes, a few for debts, one for being inconvenient to a man whose name is carved on the church pew to this day. They did it at night. They left them there until morning so the village could learn whatever lesson men believe corpses teach. Jonas swallowed. The tea had gone dry as chalk on his tongue. "And now?" Thomas looked at him with a softness Jonah did not expect. "Now horses feel what men want. No beast with sense will carry a rider under those branches if the saddle's set proper. It isn't that they see the dead. It's that they know the way a man sits when he's going to look up." "What does that mean?" "You met the truth of it last night," Thomas said. "The only way to pass when the road won't have you is to ride backward, like a penitent, so you cannot show your face to what hangs above." Jonah's palm itched. He rubbed it against his trouser seam and found, absurdly, a smudge of carrot. "You've seen this?" Thomas smiled without humor. "I've heard it from men who lived and from one who didn't, though he did not tell me with his mouth." Thread by thread, Jonah felt his certainty unravel. "I thought I was mad." "You were prudent," Thomas said, "or obedient, if you prefer the hymn." Jonah stared into his cup. He saw there not tea, but a flat brown eye and the memory of sound. Rope easing, with speaking, the breath of a night that had watched men choke. He opened his mouth to say something, defiance, maybe, or a worldly dismissal, and found there a vow instead. "I'm not riding that road again," he said. "Not at night. Not with a saddle or without. Not while that tree stands. If I must go 2 miles out of the way and ford the river where it's shallow enough to drown me, I'll do that." Thomas nodded once. "Good. Good." Thomas's gaze sharpened, as if he had spied a flaw in the shoe he shod for a friend. "Some roads we take because they are there. Some we avoid because they have learned our names." Jonah put his cup down on the scarred table and felt his hand shake. He hid it in his lap. "Who spoke to me?" If you had asked last summer, Thomas said, I'd have said conscience. If you had asked when I was 20, I'd have said an angel. Ask me now, and I will say it was the road. Roads don't want blood. They want feet. They measure it out and keep what you give. Sometimes, if they know the way of a place, they'll warn you. Not always. Sometimes the warning comes in hoof planted in dirt and a heart that will not move. Jonah considered the carriage of that idea and found it fit like a coat he had not known he owned. He rose, heart heavy and light at once. Thank you. By salt, Thomas said, and nails. And remember that vows are only as strong as the next night without a moon. News travels in a parish less like a bird and more like a stain, slow, sure, soaking into corners. By afternoon, Jonah could feel eyes on him in the smithy, in the lane, in the shop where the widow weighed salt with such accuracy it felt like an apology for whatever she could not balance in her life. It wasn't unkind attention. It was the attention of a house that has discovered a draft and tries all its windows to see which one whistles. He went home by the long way, through the birch stand and across the lower ford where the water flattened itself to pretend it was shallow. Bracken shook and stamped and blew. The picture of a horse who had forgotten the night's lesson and wanted only hay. Jonah found this infuriating and wonderful. He spent the evening mending a halter as if the leather held, in its weave, the power to tie a man to the world. He set extra wood by the hearth and locked the door and checked it again and hated himself for checking it again. Sleep came, then left, then hovered. When it finally settled, it brought the creak back with it. The creak and the soft breath and a weight around his throat that wasn't rope, but remembered rope. He woke with fingers pressed against his neck and the shame of a child caught at his own terror. I'm not going back, he said to the dim rafters. You can hang your dead by yourselves. The rafters did not answer, which comforted him in a way only absence can. Days turned to a pattern thicker than fear. Work piled. Winter did what winter always does. It asked and then asked again. Jonah and Bracken went the long way without complaint. In daylight, Jonah sometimes paused at the crest of the ridge and looked at the ash through the knit of hedges. In sun, the tree was only a tree, limbs like arms, bark like old hands. He told himself he was a fool. He told himself he had been wise. Both statements sat on the bench beside him like old couples who have learned to share a blanket. One afternoon he saw children there, a pack of them with reed flutes and daring. They had chosen a leader, blue cap, dirty knees, who boasted he would run beneath the ash and back before anyone could name him coward. Jonah's stomach turned in a way that left him sweating and cold. He cupped his hands and called across distance and bramble and the clean insolence of their youth. Off the road, he shouted. Go home. The boy in the blue cap turned and shouted something crude. The others laughed. Jonah's mouth filled with old anger and older grief, for boys who thought blood was a story until it stained their boots. He put Bracken to a trot and took the long curve that would bring him to the lane. By the time he arrived, the children had scattered like starlings flushed from field. The ash stood. The sky considered whether to snow. Jonah dismounted and stood at the broken gate between the hawthorns where his night had split. He spoke aloud, not to be brave, but to keep from being foolish. I'm not past, he told the lane. I'm only here to say you can keep your dead. I'll take mine the usual way. He turned and rode home. Thomas arrived some days later with a loaf and an old story polished by retelling to a shine that did not make it less true. Ansel Vi, he said, holding the loaf like a relic, was the sort who never learns the length of his luck until it runs out. He was worn about the ash same as you were, same as everyone is, and took that road twice as often to prove something only fools care to prove. One night, he went with a belly full of beer and a head full of righteousness. His horse refused. He struck it. It refused again. He got off to drag. The horse bolted home without him, because some animals do not argue with the dark. Thomas seated himself heavily. Jonah fixed tea, because warming a story is the duty of the listener. Ansel went ahead. He said later, when he could say anything, that the ash looked taller than a tree has a right to be. He saw nothing else. He felt the rope around him like a friendly arm. When the horse turned up at his gate without him, his wife lit a lantern and woke the village. They found him at first light, blue at the lips, and hanging low enough his toes had made little trenches in the mud. He had untied himself some. The knot had undone some. The road had done some. Between the three of them, he came down alive and never spoke loud again. He took to mending shoes and listening when people told him where not to go. "Why tell me this?" Jonah asked, though he knew. Fear is a shape that requires only a line or two to recognize itself. "So that the part of you that thinks bravery is a matter of crowds knows better," Thomas said. "It's a matter of doors, which you open, which you close, which you leave locked though your hand itches to try the handle." Jonah thought about handles in the night. He thought about ropes and boys with blue caps and men with blue lips and the way a world insists on repetitions until you quit giving it the same cue. He poured Thomas more tea. Spring stiffened the ground. Sap rose. The ash put out buds the color of warnings. Jonah avoided the road as promised, but the world is a maker of inconveniences. Word came from the West Farm that the old milk cow had calved wrong, and a hand was wanted who could lift without complaint and speak to frightened animals in a voice they trusted. Jonah had both qualifications and, worse, the disposition that cannot turn away when called. He saddled Bracken at dusk, meaning to take the long loop, meaning to keep his vow in the letter, if not in the spirit. The long loop had flooded. The river had shrugged out of its banks and made meadow into mirror. The lower ford, which had pretended safety all winter, whispered drowning in a voice so persuasive even Bracken refused to listen. Jonah did his own arithmetic. The West Farm's lantern was already a coin on the horizon. The calf would turn wrong and die while he composed a better plan. He sat on Bracken and stared at the line of hawthorns and the suggestion of the ash and felt the exact measure of a vow against the weight of a life. "Backward it is," he said, not cheerfully. He dismounted, turned the saddle as practiced, tightened the girth, and hauled himself up with as much grace as a man facing his own foolish consistency can have. Bracken shifted once, settling the new wrong into a workable right. "Go on," Jonah said. Bracken did. The night was not as black as the one before, but darkness makes its own economies. As they entered the pinch, the air cooled not to the marrow, but to the skin, a prickling the size of coins. Jonah kept his gaze on the ribbon of road unspooling behind them and recited, without meaning to, the names of men he had known who had died ordinary deaths that had required no legends. Eli in the flood, Matthew under the cart, old Ben in his chair between one breath and the next. He found this list comforting, a litany of endings that had not acquired addresses. The creaking came, then, from the ash, the soft breath, the clack of wood. He felt, in a way impossible to deny, eyes on the crown of his bowed head. He did not look. He rode as a man rides in a church, hat in hand. A voice, not the same as the one that had instructed him, this one lower, nearer, spoke. "Name them." Jonah thought the night was asking for the names of the dead. "No," said the voice. "Name us." He kept his eyes fixed. "I don't know you." "You know our shape," it said. "You know our weight." He swallowed, finding the words afraid to be born. "Men." "Men," agreed the voice, with a wryness that took Jonah's breath. "Many kinds of men. Thieves, sinners, inconveniences, examples, debt, dispute, a brother in a bad year, a rival with a prettier wife, a traveler whose accent sounded wrong." "Why speak to me?" Jonah whispered. "Because you have a horse who listens and hands that know their own strength," said the voice. "Because you obeyed. Because you will carry words where a dead throat cannot." "I'll tell Thomas," Jonah said absurdly. The name of his friend felt like dry land. "Tell any who will weigh it," said the voice. "There are ways to pass an old hurt. Backward is one. Naming is another. Shame is a third. Choose any. Choose all." Jonah felt Bracken's stride lengthen. The cold loosened, the hedges softened, the road widened under them like a mercy. "Do not come this way again," said the voice, almost kind. "Not because we will harm you, because you will be harmed by the wanting to look." They passed out of the pinch and into the night that belonged only to weather. Jonah slipped down and righted the world, saddle girth mind. He rubbed Bracken's neck until the horse sighed and dropped his head, and he whispered, as if speaking to a child, "Good, good, good." At the West Farm, the calf came wrong but not ruined. Jonah did what he could, and the cow did the larger share, and the room's temperature rose with the relief of breathing. The lantern burned until the wick surrendered, and then they did the rest by feel. When it was done and the calf stood at last, knees askew, Jonah accepted a mug of something hot and a stool by the door. He sat and let sweat dry on his back and thought of the ash and the voices and the line of vow draws that a man must not pretend is a fence when it is only a line. He rode home by the dawn, which makes all trees into themselves again. He did not ride that road again. In the years that followed, Jonah lived the way careful men do. He loved what could be loved without cost. He mended what could be mended without lying, and he avoided the places that had learned his name. The ash stood. The parish grew a little. Children learned different songs, and then the same ones again. Bracken grew old and wiser still, and went into the ground with the dignity of an animal who had never pretended to be anything else. When people asked Jonah, as they sometimes did when ale softened his edges, whether ghosts were real, he shrugged and said, "Horses, no." If pressed, he would tell the story, the short version, the one shaped to fit an evening. A dark road, a horse that would not go, a voice that gave a ridiculous instruction that turned out not to be ridiculous at all. He did not use words like hanging men. He did not need to. The room would feel the creak and the breath in the silences between what he said. Once, a stranger at the inn laughed and said, "So all a man need do to avoid the dead is sit backward like a child?" Jonah shook his head, emptied his cup, and said no. He has to be willing to look foolish to himself and humble to the road. That's harder. We'd rather die than be ridiculous. Most of us. Thomas, old now and happy to be old, would sometimes add, "And if you find yourself before a tree that has work it's done too often, name the ones who put it to work as well as the ones who swung. Else you leave most of the ghosts uncounted." This is the part listeners disliked. Stories about monsters and trees are tidy. Stories about men are messy. The ash, left to itself, leafed and unleafed. A storm took the crown one autumn, and everyone said the danger had passed. The road widened in summer when Counselor Levin, tired of having to go the long way in his carriage, paid for men with tools to come and scold the hedges back. For a season, it seemed the world had grown up and out of its own legends. But once on a late night, a cart horse stopped there and would not pass, and the driver, a boy with a blue cap inherited from an older brother, turned the harness and backed the cart the entire length of a lane rather than force the matter. Ask him why, and he'd say he did not know. Ask his horse, and it would flick its ears and tell you plainly if you could hear through skin. Jonah grew old. He married late, the way some men do when they encounter at last a heart as patient as theirs. He had a daughter who learned to ride perched on Bracken's successor like a small queen. He taught her the names of the roads and which ones to trust. He taught her the words you say to a horse and the ones you say to yourself. Once, under a new moon, because life is rude that way, they had to pass the hawthorns. On foot, no saddle, no horse. The girl, whose name was Eliza, took his hand without being told and said, before he could speak, "We'll look backward, won't we?" "We will," Jonah said, and they did. The ash said nothing, because sometimes a place sees you have already learned a lesson and does not repeat the lesson in cruelty. Some nights, when sleep sat heavy, Jonah would hear the small clack of wood and the sigh of rope, as if memory itself had joints that complained in damp weather. He would lie there and count his breaths and name ordinary labors, stones lifted, roofs mended, calves turned, to anchor himself to a world that contains both kinds of sound. The ones you make and the ones made long before you, awaiting your ears. He never saw the dead. He never needed to. The not seeing was the point. Years later, after Jonah was gone and Eliza was old enough to be asked for advice by people who admired how she had avoided certain mistakes, a boy in a blue cap, no relation to the other, caps are like that, came to her and said, "Is it true about the saddle?" Eliza, who had her father's way of letting silence warm a room, considered whether a story wanted telling or only a sentence. She chose the sentence. "If a horse won't go past the ash at night," she said, "turn the saddle and ride as if you were leaving instead of coming. Do not look up. If a voice speaks, listen. If it asks for names, give them. When you are through, put the saddle right and do not return that way. Not because they will get you if you do, because you will become the sort of person who thinks you must look." The boy wrinkled his nose. "That's all." "That's enough," Eliza said. "It sounds simple until you try." He went away dissatisfied, as boys are required by some law of whether to be. He told his friends later that the old woman had grown dull, that the world had grown dull with her, and they must make their own entertainment. They did, for a time, untroubled by anything but their own reflections. But in the hedged lane, the ash held out its fingers to the cold and measured what went beneath it, and when a rider came bold and foolish on a night with no moon, the horse planted his iron shoes in the dirt and said in the oldest language there is, "No." And somewhere a voice, no age, no accent, patient as rope, offered a spare instruction to anyone in the habit of hearing. Put the saddle on backwards. If you're lucky, you will, and if you're luckier still, you'll never need to again.